The night was silent, but beneath the calm surface of northern France, a secret lay hidden in concrete and steel. Deep inside the earth, Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe had built fortresses unlike anything the Allies had ever seen. Immense submarine pens, armored with walls so thick they mocked ordinary bombs. To the men who guarded them, these bunkers felt invincible. A fortress within a fortress, where U-boats could be refueled and repaired, ready to slip back into the Atlantic and choke Britain's lifeline. But invincibility is an illusion. And illusions, once shattered, leave only fear. You are there, staring at those hulking pens as the ground trembles. A new sound fills the sky, not the usual drone of bombers, but a deeper growl, a storm rolling in with metallic fury. The British call it the Tallboy. A bomb so massive it isn't dropped, it's unleashed. As it plummets through the clouds, you realize something unthinkable. Göring's concrete monsters are not as eternal as he promised. Steel can crack. Concrete can bleed. And the myth of Nazi invulnerability is about to be ripped apart by the thunder of a single weapon that will change the war forever. Can concrete really defy the sky? What if you were told that no weapon on Earth could touch you? What if you lived, worked, and fought inside walls so thick, so monstrous, that even the heaviest bombs of the age bounced off like pebbles in the rain? Would you believe you were safe? Or would you always wait for the day the sky proved you wrong? The story begins in the fevered heart of Nazi Germany's war machine. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic raged like a slow, strangling fire. German U-boats, the silent wolves of the sea, were carving through Allied shipping lines with ruthless efficiency. Britain, an island nation dependent on the sea for survival, found itself gasping. Convoys were ambushed, merchant ships turned into burning pyres on the cold Atlantic waves, and food supplies dwindled dangerously close to collapse. Hitler's high command believed the U-boat campaign could starve Britain into submission, without ever needing to invade its shores. But there was a problem even the feared wolf packs couldn't solve: vulnerability. Submarines were deadly hunters at sea, but fragile when they returned to port. Goring and the Luftwaffe engineers were handed an impossible task: create sanctuaries where U-boats could rest, reload and rearm, fortresses impervious to Allied attack. They chose concrete as their weapon. And not just any concrete. Walls and roofs measured in meters, not inches. In the occupied ports of Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire and La Rochelle, the Nazis poured rivers of cement, building pens that looked less like buildings and more like mountains carved by human hands. Imagine it: cavernous chambers stretching hundreds of feet, roofs as thick as cathedrals are tall, reinforced with iron that twisted like veins inside a giant's body. The men who labored on these pens were a grim mixture of conscripted workers, POWs, and local civilians pressed into service. They toiled under the shadow of German guns, pouring concrete day after day, until the structures rose from the earth like defiant fists aimed at the sky. For the Allies, every passing week meant more U-boats hidden beneath this concrete shield, more ships sunk, more lives lost at sea. By 1943, Allied bombing campaigns had grown ferocious. Squadrons of Lancasters and flying fortresses pounded German-held France, but when their bombs fell on the submarine pens, something terrifying happened. Nothing. The explosions thundered, fires raged, but when the smoke cleared, the pens stood untouched. Pilots returning from these raids reported the same chilling truth. It was like bombing the side of a mountain. Inside, the U-boats remained unharmed, engineers worked without pause, and crews drank, laughed, and prepared to strike again. Goring boasted that his fortresses were proof of German genius, proof that the Reich could outlast the skies themselves. But invincibility invites challenge. And across the Channel, inside the secret halls of the British Air Ministry, engineers and scientists burned with frustration. Ordinary bombs couldn't dent the pens, but what if a bomb didn't need to? What if a weapon could dig, burrow, and then shatter the foundations beneath? Out of this fury and desperation came a maverick engineer named Wallis, a man whose ideas seemed impossible, until the war forced them into reality. Wallis proposed something radical: a bomb not designed to explode on the surface, but to strike with the force of an earthquake. He envisioned a deep penetrator, a bomb that would pierce soil and concrete, burrow deep, and then detonate with seismic fury, cracking fortresses not from above but from within. The concept sounded insane to many. Such a bomb would need to be enormous, far heavier than anything aircraft had ever carried. But Wallis believed, with quiet certainty, that the future of the war depended on such an invention. And so the dream of the Tallboy was born. The Tallboy was no ordinary bomb. It was a giant steel spear, over 21 feet long, weighing nearly 6 tons, designed to fall at supersonic speeds. Unlike conventional bombs, it wasn't simply dropped. It was released with precision, aimed to strike with surgical devastation. When it hit, its streamlined shape allowed it to penetrate earth, concrete, or water before detonating. The resulting explosion wasn't just a blast. It was a shockwave, a geological tremor capable of toppling even the mightiest walls. But creating such a weapon was only half the battle. The question remained: could any aircraft carry it? Only the legendary Avro Lancaster, the workhorse of Britain's bomber command, could be modified to lift such a monstrous payload. Bomb bays had to be stripped and reinforced, crews retrained, flight paths recalculated. Every raid with a Tallboy would mean fewer bombs dropped overall. But if Wallis was right, a single Tallboy could do what 1,000 smaller bombs could not. By mid-1944, the first Tallboys were ready. And the target list was obvious. Goring's concrete pens, those untouchable bastions of Nazi pride, would be tested against the fury of a weapon the world had never seen. For the U-boat crews sheltering beneath their fortress roofs, life still felt safe. They smoked their cigarettes, shared stories, and laughed at the thought of Allied pilots wasting bombs on their mountain of concrete. But they did not yet know that high above them, in the cold night sky, British crews were preparing to carry a different kind of storm. The stage was set. The hunters of the sea had their lair. The engineers of Britain had their weapon. The question that burned in every pilot's mind, in every engineer's heart, and in every Allied commander's soul was the same. Could concrete really defy the sky? Or would Goring's fortresses crumble under the weight of a weapon born from desperation, daring, and human genius? The answer was coming. Carried on the wings of Lancasters, in the steel belly of a bomb called the Tallboy. What happens when the sky becomes an earthquake? What if the bombs falling from above didn't just explode on impact, but shook the very ground beneath your feet, like a man-made earthquake tearing open the earth? What if the fortress you trusted, the mountain of concrete you believed indestructible, suddenly groaned like a wounded beast, splintering under invisible cracks? Could you still believe in invincibility then? The night of June 14, 1944, marked the beginning of a new kind of war in the skies. Just a week after Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, Bomber Command prepared for its most audacious test yet, the Tallboy's baptism of fire. For weeks, intelligence had reported U-boat pens operating at full force, their hidden lairs buzzing with activity. The pens at Le Havre and Boulogne, and especially at Saint-Nazaire, stood like stone giants, immune to countless bombing raids. The question whispered in briefing rooms was simple. Could Wallis's monstrous bomb finally bring the giants to their knees? Inside a hangar in eastern England, under dim lights and heavy silence, ground crews prepared the Avro Lancasters of No. 617 Squadron, the famous dam-busters. These men had already achieved the impossible once, skipping bouncing bombs across German dams the year before. Now they were entrusted with another unthinkable task, slinging a 6-ton monster into the heart of Goring's fortresses. Mechanics struggled with the sheer size of the weapon. The Tallboy barely fit into the modified bomb bay, its steel nose gleaming under the floodlights. Pilots and navigators studied maps again and again, knowing that precision, not sheer numbers, would decide the night. The takeoff was thunderous. One by one, the Lancasters roared into the cold air, their engines straining against the weight of the Tallboys. The crews knew the risks. With only a few bombs in the raid, every strike had to count. There would be no carpet of fire to hide in, no room for error. Their target was simple in theory, impossible in practice. A thick slab of concrete, built to shrug off every weapon known to mankind. As the bombers crossed the channel, a tense silence filled the cabins. Navigators whispered course adjustments, gunners scanned the skies for German night fighters, and pilots kept their hands tight on the controls. Somewhere below, German searchlights sliced through the dark like claws. The fortresses were waiting, their flak guns primed, their crews certain of safety. Then the moment came. Over St. Nazaire, the 1st Lancaster lined up its run. The bomb aimer's voice crackled over the intercom. "Steady, steady, bomb's gone." The Tallboy detached from its cradle and began its deadly descent. Unlike other bombs, it didn't tumble wildly. It cut through the night air like an arrow, gathering speed, reaching near supersonic velocity as it hurtled toward the earth. On the ground, inside the pen, German sailors felt the familiar rumble of approaching bombers. They had grown used to this nightly ritual: the thunder, the impact, the dust raining down harmlessly from ceilings thicker than any cathedral roof. Some smirked, some ignored it. But then came a sound none of them had heard before. Not the hollow thud of a wasted bomb. No, this was deeper. A resonant crack, like the earth itself being torn open. The Tallboy hit. Not on the roof, not wasted on the surface, but burrowing into the ground near the pen's foundation. For a moment, there was silence. Then came the explosion. A shockwave rippled through soil and rock, traveling beneath the fortress like a subterranean storm. Concrete groaned. Steel reinforcements twisted. Inside, lights flickered, dust cascaded from the ceilings, and men froze as they felt the ground itself betray them. When dawn broke, reconnaissance photos told the story. The roof of the pen still stood, scarred but intact. But something far more sinister had happened beneath. The ground around the pen had shifted. Massive cracks spread like veins through the foundation. Doors jammed. Machinery rattled. The pens were no longer unshakable fortresses. They were wounded beasts, crippled not by fire from above, but by the earth itself tearing from below. In Whitehall, British planners studied the results with grim satisfaction. Barnes-Wallis had been right. Concrete could resist bombs, but no fortress could resist geology. The Tallboy had turned air power into seismic power, and suddenly, Goring's boast of invincibility sounded hollow. But for the crews who flew those missions, the price was heavy. Every raid was a razor's edge between triumph and death. Flak filled the skies like a swarm of steel bees, tearing holes in wings, shattering fuselages, killing friends mid-sentence. One Lancaster spiraled down in flames, Tallboy still in its belly, exploding on impact like a miniature apocalypse. Survivors parachuted into the cold night, only to be captured or shot. For them, the earthquake bomb was not just an engineering miracle, it was a burden of blood and fire. And yet, they returned again and again. Boulogne, Le Havre, St. Nazaire, Brest. Each raid carried the same suspense, the same whispered question. Would the Tallboy find its mark? Sometimes it did, shaking pens to their core. Sometimes it missed, burying itself deep in the soil, detonating harmlessly in open fields. But even the misses carried power. German workers were forced to dig out unexploded monsters, each one a reminder that safety was slipping away. The psychological toll was devastating. Once, U-boat crews had swaggered in their concrete lairs, mocking the useless British bombs. Now, every tremor, every faint crack in the walls filled them with dread. Was this the night the roof would collapse? Was this the mission where safety turned into tomb? By late 1944, the Tallboy had grown into legend. The pens still stood, scarred but not destroyed, yet their effectiveness was crippled. Repairs slowed. U-boats couldn't enter and leave with the same confidence. German morale cracked as surely as the foundations of their fortresses. For the first time, concrete no longer promised salvation. But the story was not finished. Because if the Tallboy could wound Goring's fortresses, what would happen when an even bigger weapon, the Grand Slam, was unleashed? What happens when the sky itself decides to bring earthquakes not just to pens, but to bridges, viaducts, and entire strongholds of the Reich? The answer was coming. And the question burned brighter than ever. What happens when the sky becomes an earthquake? Can any fortress survive forever? What if you built walls so thick that even the gods of war could not break them? What if you poured concrete by the ton, layer upon layer, until your fortress became a mountain in its own right? Would that fortress stand for eternity? Or would time, ingenuity, and determination eventually find the cracks that even you could not see? By late 1944, Goring's once proud submarine pens were no longer symbols of invincibility. They were symbols of desperation. From the Atlantic coast of France to the harbors of Norway, the pens had been carved into the landscape with the arrogance of a regime convinced it would last 1,000 years. They stood immense, silent, their grey silhouettes dominating the waterfronts of Lorient, Brest, La Palisse, and Saint-Nazaire. These were more than bunkers. They were monuments to Nazi ambition, designed to house fleets of submarines that would strangle the lifeblood from Britain and America. But in war, permanence is an illusion. And by 1944, the illusion was breaking. The Tallboys had begun to cripple foundations, and with every crack that spread through concrete, confidence drained from the men inside. The U-boat crews who once swaggered through the pens now looked over their shoulders, listening to the creak of walls, to the faint rumbles beneath their boots. The pens had not collapsed, true, but neither had they remained untouchable. The fortress was bleeding, slowly, invisibly. The British airmen of 617 Squadron, the dam-busters, returned again and again, their Lancasters carrying Wallis's deadly creations into the night. Each raid was a gamble. Flak guns spat fire into the skies. Searchlights pinned aircraft like insects against the stars. German fighters prowled, hungry for lumbering bombers weighed down with their monstrous payloads. And yet, through all the fire and fury, the Lancasters pressed on. They had seen what the Tallboys could do. They knew that even the strongest walls had limits. At Saint-Nazaire, cracks widened. At Brest, sections of roof shifted. At La Palisse, foundations buckled. Reconnaissance photographs revealed scars, great craters gouged out near the pens, rail lines twisted, doors bent out of shape. The Germans patched and repaired, pouring fresh concrete into the wounds, but every patch carried a hidden truth. The Reich was spending time and resources on survival, not expansion. And time was something Hitler no longer had. Yet the pens did not fall. They endured like stubborn beasts, defying not just bombs but belief itself. Allied planners, frustrated, began asking a darker question. Could any fortress truly be destroyed from the air? If the pens could not be toppled, what did that mean for the war? Were the Allies condemned to fight forever against a Reich shielded by concrete mountains? But Wallis was not done dreaming. He knew the Tallboy had proven the concept, but he also knew it was only the beginning. His mind had already leapt ahead, to something even bigger, even more destructive. The Grand Slam. If the Tallboy was an earthquake, the Grand Slam was to be a tectonic shift. 10 tons of steel and explosive, designed to burrow deeper and strike harder than anything mankind had ever unleashed. With it, Wallis hoped, even the greatest fortresses would crumble into dust. Still, for now, the Tallboy carried the burden. And though the pens stood, the psychological damage ran deeper than the cracks in the foundations. German workers dreaded the sirens. Submarine crews slept uneasily, their dreams haunted by the thought of roofs collapsing, of water rushing in, of their sanctuary turning into a tomb. In whispered conversations, they admitted what Goring never would. No fortress could survive forever. Meanwhile, out at sea, the tide was turning. Allied escort carriers, long-range bombers, and new radar technologies had begun to turn the Atlantic into a graveyard for U-boats. Losses mounted, and the once proud wolf packs returned thinner and weaker after every patrol. The pens that had been built as symbols of triumph became instead shelters for dying fleets. The cracks in concrete mirrored the cracks in strategy, in morale, in the Reich itself. But still, the question lingered. Could the Allies actually bring down these monsters? Or would Goring's concrete stand as a testament to Nazi endurance, long after the war had burned itself out? For every crack, for every crater, the pens still loomed, their shadows stretching across the harbors like reminders of a war that refused to end. And so, in the final months of 1944, as the Allies pushed into France and Germany reeled from defeat after defeat, the pens remained. Immense. Defiant. Waiting. And somewhere in the skies above, crews of 617 Squadron whispered the question to themselves, over maps and black coffee, before climbing once more into their Lancasters. Could any fortress survive forever? When does invincibility become a tomb? What if the very fortress that promised safety became the place that trapped you? What if the thick walls meant to shield you from fire instead sealed you inside, as cracks spread and ceilings threatened to fall? Could the same walls that once inspired laughter in the face of danger become the silent tombstones of those who trusted them most? By early 1945, the war was entering its final, desperate act. The Allies had crossed into Germany. The Reich's armies were retreating on all fronts. Yet in the harbors of western France, Goring's colossal pens still loomed like stubborn scars. To the untrained eye, they seemed untouched, vast slabs of concrete rising from the water, still capable of sheltering the deadly U-boats that had terrorized the Atlantic. But looks were deceiving. Inside, beneath the echoing ceilings, the air carried a new tension. Each groan of steel, each whisper of shifting stone, reminded the men that their sanctuary was not eternal. The Tallboys had not flattened the pens, but they had cracked their bones. Doors jammed. Dry docks leaked. Machinery broke down with unnerving frequency. Crews lived with the constant suspicion that the next raid might be the one that sealed their fate. Some spoke in hushed tones about comrades who never emerged, caught in collapsed chambers or drowned when the water burst in. The fortress, once a shield, had become a gamble. The dam-busters and other squadrons pressed their campaign with relentless determination. Every mission was a dance with death. German flak still spat fire into the skies, night fighters still prowled, but Allied pilots had grown sharper, more precise and more daring. They flew low and steady, lining up their targets with nerves of steel, releasing tallboys that seemed less like bombs and more like judgment itself. The ground shook, foundations trembled, and men inside the pens clutched at their helmets, praying the ceiling would hold. Barnes Wallis watched the reports with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. His weapon had proven itself beyond doubt. The pens were crippled, U-boat operations slowed to a crawl, and morale within the Kriegsmarine was bleeding away. Yet Wallis was not blind to the cost. Brave crews risked everything each night to deliver his creations. Many did not return. For them, the earthquake bomb was not just an engineering marvel. It was a sentence written in fire, one they read with every takeoff into hostile skies. Still, the results were undeniable. The wolf packs of the Atlantic, once the terror of Allied shipping, now returned to their lairs battered, broken, or not at all. Convoys sailed with growing confidence. Supplies flowed. The great gamble of Hitler's U-boat strategy collapsed under the combined weight of technology, bravery, and persistence. And the mighty pens, once hailed as indestructible, now served only as symbols of futility. They stood, yes, but what they sheltered was no longer a fleet of hunters, only the remnants of a dream slipping into ruin. Inside Germany, whispers grew louder. Could even Hitler himself believe in invincibility anymore? The pens were cracked, the Luftwaffe was shattered, the Wehrmacht bled dry. Goring's boast of fortresses eternal now rang hollow. Even the most loyal officers saw the truth. Every fortress has its breaking point, every wall its weakness, every empire its end. And yet, the pens did not fall completely. They clung stubbornly to existence, as if refusing to die. Even as the Reich collapsed, they remained standing, monuments to wasted labor, to arrogance, to the cruelty of forcing men to build tombs they would later occupy. Long after the guns fell silent in May 1945, these pens still scarred the coastlines, too massive to erase, too heavy to demolish. They endured as ghosts of a war that had ended, relics of a time when men believed concrete could hold back the sky. But those who walked their echoing halls after the war felt a different truth. The pens were not fortresses. They were mausoleums. Mausoleums of ambition, of cruelty, of men who believed in permanence but found only dust. And in those ruins, one question remained unanswered. When does invincibility become a tomb? Perhaps the answer was written not in the survival of concrete, but in the silence of those it could not save. What legacy do crumbling giants leave behind? What happens when the giants of war outlive the war itself? When fortresses built to crush an enemy survive their creators, standing not as triumphs but as scars? Do they remain symbols of power, or do they become grim reminders that even the mightiest walls cannot outlast the truth of history? The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945. Hitler was dead. Goring was captured. The Reich had crumbled under the relentless weight of Allied armies, Soviet advances, and skies ruled by bombers. But along the coastlines of France, Norway, and Germany, the submarine pens remained. They had not fallen in fire. They had not been erased by the Tallboys or the Grand Slams. Instead they stood, immense, hollow, empty, like broken teeth jutting from the earth. For Allied soldiers who walked into these ruins, the feeling was eerie. The pens were colossal, larger than imagination, their chambers echoing with silence. Graffiti, cigarette butts and broken tools lay scattered where once U-boat crews had laughed, cursed, and planned their hunts. The smell of oil and damp concrete lingered. But the men were gone. The wolf packs were gone. The fortresses that had promised invincibility had become empty shells, mausoleums of a failed dream. In the years after the war, the world grappled with the question of what to do with these giants. Some became museums, where visitors walked through the cold halls to feel the weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. Others were left to decay, their massive walls too thick to demolish, too costly to repurpose. And some, still intact, were quietly used again, this time not by Nazis, but by new navies facing new wars. The Cold War turned concrete monsters into pawns once more. For the survivors of 617 Squadron, for the engineers who had built the Tallboy, the legacy was mixed. They had proven that human ingenuity could overcome even the thickest walls, that no fortress was eternal. But they had also seen the cost. Brave men lost in fire and steel. Nights filled with fear, tension, and the endless hum of engines heading into flak-filled skies. To them, the pens were not just structures. They were battlefields, victories won at staggering price. And yet, history's judgment is clear. The pens did not win the war. They delayed, they sheltered, they consumed unimaginable resources, but they did not change the outcome. The U-boat menace was broken, the Atlantic secured, the Reich destroyed. All that remains of Goring's dream are cracked walls, crumbling chambers, and echoes of voices long gone. So what is their legacy? Perhaps it is a warning. A warning that arrogance builds monuments as surely as ambition builds weapons. A warning that the belief in invincibility is the most dangerous illusion of all. For in the end, the pens stand not as symbols of German might, but as gravestones of wasted lives and shattered dreams. And as you walk among them today, cold concrete stretching above you like cliffs, you can almost hear it. The distant rumble of engines, the whistle of bombs, the crack of earth trembling beneath. The Tallboys are gone, the war is gone, but the question lingers in the silence of those halls. What legacy do crumbling giants leave behind? Maybe the answer is simple. They leave us memory. They leave us caution. And they leave us the unshakable truth that no fortress, no empire, no arrogance, can survive forever.